Hey everyone, and welcome to IPS and Kablooe's interview series on topics related to medical product design and development. I'm your host, Rachel Aponte, and today's segment is titled, What Cold Beer Taught Us About Medical Product Design. Our guests are Mitch Maiman, President and Co-Founder of IPS in New York, and Tom Kramer, President and CEO of Kablooe Design in Minneapolis. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So glad you're here. Now, this is a very intriguing topic, okay? It's titled, What a Cold Beer Taught Us About Medical Device Development. And so I'm going to take it to Mitch first, because I think he can answer this more in more detail. So what project was it where you learned something from a chilled beer?
So, I mean, one thing that applies to virtually any product, whether it's got to do with chilled beer or a medical device, there's no project so simple that it can't get messed up. And when you think you know everything, just be prepared to find out something you didn't know. The project that comes to mind when it comes to chilled beer is we were working a couple of years ago with Anheuser-Busch on developing something called the Beer Box. It's a beer vending system, and it involves chilling, moving, and dispensing open 25-ounce cans of Budweiser beer. The one thing that strikes me that sort of goes with the corollary is that one thinks that opening a can of beer, a cold beer, is a relatively simple thing, and for a human, it is very simple to get the can of beer. You grab the top and you pop it open. If the top is off a little bit, well, you just move your finger automatically and you pop it open, or you pull it back from wherever it is, and everything moves along fine. But a machine doesn't have that flexibility. So, the thing we kind of discovered is not only did we have to find the tab, we had to sort of orient the mechanism to pop open the top. And then the other nuanced thing that is really an observational thing that you don't notice in day-to-day life, is that it's not a simple pry bar to open the can of beer. You have to stick your finger under, lift and pull.
That's
right. We showered many engineers with beer in the process of learning how to successfully open a can of beer. And that was quite an interesting project. And we learned a lot about canned beer and the opening of canned beer.
Maybe you could explain, because I think most people now, when they're imagining this in their mind, and they're thinking about a pop machine, right? Why is this any harder or different than a pop machine? Can you explain why the beer had to dispense a can opened?
Yeah, so let's talk about the use case here, because that's really critical. If you go, it really was targeted at sports and entertainment venues. And if you live in the US, you may or may not realize that you're not only able to sell an unopened can or bottle of anything in a stadium or in an auditorium. You have to always dispense it open, or most often what you find out is you end up with a cup of something. And it's got to do with federal regulation. So we have to dispense the can open. So the question is, why would you even want a vending machine in these venues? But if you think about the experience of going to, let's say, a baseball game, and you're between innings and you're trying to grab a quick beer between the innings, and or between teams taking the field, you get up and you go to the atrium area and you find there's a long line at the beer vending station. And the idea here is sort of like what you find like in Lowe's and Home Depot, where you have sort of a self-checkout. So this machine is a self-checkout beer dispenser that takes a credit card or debit card transaction that we designed into it, and then chills and manipulates and dispenses a very nice open can of cold beer. So that's the use case around it. It's in a retail world, they call it line busting, but it's really the same concept in a sports or entertainment venue.
But there are regulations, right, against they couldn't, in other words, the machine couldn't dispense a closed can of beer.
That's correct. I mean, I think the regulation goes back to concerns about people throwing a can of beer or throwing a bottle of soda. And, you know, a can of beer empty is pretty light, but full, it could do some damage. And we're talking 25-ounce cans here. So these are the American industrial size, you know, go big cans of beer.
I think these rules come from soccer fans and hockey fans, right?
That's right.
That's more unruly than baseball fans, you know.
Now, how do these chilled cans of beers have to do with medical product design? And I think Tom can take over here and say, like, what are these lessons learned creating this machine that can dispense an open can of beer? What does that have to do with medical product design?
Well, you know, so I've learned a lot of things from a nice cold beer. It doesn't have anything to do with medical device, but on the medical device side, there's really a lot of parallel learnings, you know, and one of the first ones is, you know, Mitch just explained about there was a regulatory issue. You can't, a machine can't dispense a beer unless it's an open container. And there's a learning there in medical devices. Regulatory restrictions often lead to really interesting innovations. And, you know, one particular device we worked on that's owned by Boston Scientific now, it's a minimally invasive surgical device that created lesions in human tissue during a surgery by introducing a hot vapor. And at one point, there were reimbursement issues around that because there was going to be no insurance reimbursement for a boiler that boiled water, you know, to deliver a lesion. Well, you don't want to make a device that can't be reimbursed by insurance if you're making a surgical device, or you're never going to make any money on it. So the team creatively switched and said, you know what, there is a reimbursement code for RF energy delivering, creating a lesion in human tissue. Why don't we use an RF energy coil inside the device to heat the saline that creates the vapor lesion? And so that became a pathway. So you know, that can be the type of thing that really leads to sort of a medical device innovation.
You know, it's also in the beer, you may not realize it. I mean, I learned all there is to know about the beer business from the Anheuser-Busch folks, but it's a highly regulated industry. There's two things there. First off, there's a lot of regulations around the sale and distribution of beer, just as there are in medical devices. And the other thing is we integrated a payment system to this vending machine, obviously, to take credit cards and debit cards. And there, it's got a lot of parallels to sort of HIPAA compliance. You know, people are concerned on the one hand about, you know, use or misuse of their medical data, but on a day-to-day basis, we're even more concerned about people getting access to our credit code number, getting access to the PIN code for our debit card. So there's a huge amount of regulatory requirement around any transaction that's going to be dealing with secure payment information and how that information is encrypted, just as you would have to do in a HIPAA compliant case, and how you transmit encrypted data and decrypt that data. So there are quite a number of parallels there in those two industries.
Absolutely. Yeah. What about testing and user research? What did that teach you about the product design efforts?
Well, you know, I think, again, if we look at the experience that Mitch described when he was talking about the use case of somebody actually trying to open a can, and, you know, he was sharing about the kinetics that go into that. You know, we have to think about those kind of kinetics in medical device all the time. You can make a tool, let's say a surgical tool that is going to do something, but it's really important to do that testing up front to understand what those kinetics are before you go running off with an idea. You know, a lot of times as engineers, we think, oh, I have, like, for instance, we worked on a device that had to implant an electrode in the carotid artery. As an engineer, we can come up with an idea and say, oh, I know exactly how an electrode should be placed and held into position within the carotid artery. But before we go run and pell-mell down that path and start creating expensive prototypes and testing them, we're wise to go back and discover some of the things that Mitch was describing. It's like, what is a user going to do? What position is their hand going to be in? What's the dexterity of their fingers? What's required of that dexterity? And how are they going to have to position? Because that totally changes how we might design that tool and how the end effector on that tool on the distal end might actually deploy an electrode and actually get it to the location that you need it to be in and hold it in place. You don't know those things just by, osmosis when you start.
Right.
You have to figure those things out. And the only way to do that is through numerous user tests along the way.
Right.
I can add too on the beer vending system that we did, it's very similar. You would think that with CAD models and analysis tools, you can sort of figure out every possible thing that can go wrong. But, there's an old saying from, I think, an ancient Chinese general that said, no plan survives the first day of battle. In a complicated system, things don't work out the way you plan. And the only way you find out some nuances is by building prototypes, testing, and discovering and learning from those. Besides the issue of just popping open the top being an issue, before we even got to get the can to the opening system, there were a lot of nuances in how you handle a can of beer and the mechanisms for, controlling columns of cans of, 2 rows of columns of cans of beer. Wasn't all that easy. A lot was discovered along the way. Again, lots of unintended open cans of beer spraying beer everywhere. That's a way of getting like instant, test results. As you drop a can and poof, pops open and there's beer all over the place. There's no wondering what went wrong, but
Rachel, I think that's a big learning right there that medical device folks can take away from a non-medical situation. A lot of times medical device folks think testing has to be so rigorous and so complicated and so structured. But here Mitch has got engineers in the workshop spraying beer all over themselves.
That's right.
And learning a massive amount up front. And that just shows that testing can be simple and quick and easy in the beginning if you do it early. Those early, simple, quick tests are important. And you hear the people talk about fail early, fail often. We always like to say fail early, fail often, but fail smart. And the smart part is doing those quick, simple, easy tests early. Failing smart is spraying beer all over yourself on day one, and then and having that light bulb go off in your head about things that you can do differently before you get to the really expensive testing.
Yeah, I'll say another thing is when you're dealing with a very complex system, and there are many, medical device systems can be incredibly complex. Breaking that down is really important. In other words, it's important eventually to do a system level test. But the one thing we learned very quickly is we had to break out the opening mechanism subsystem so that we could test that all by itself, because all of the front end to that can be tested separately, but we needed something that's much smaller in scale and scope to be able to do some iterative testing and massaging of the design. And so we broke the system down into multiple sections that could be tested. Obviously we could test the payment system independent of the back end vending system, but even the electromechanical systems, we had to break down into subsystems that could be tested independently and then reintegrated, tested again as a system, finding and uncovering another set of problems. But you need to sort of make sure you have to build it up piecemeal, as you do with any, if it's a medical or non-medical device. You have to sort of break down that each subsystem and it works independently. And then when you integrate them, you have to integrate them together. But it's really chasing your tail to try to deal with everything at the full system level when you've got multiple subsystems that are of suspect quality at that point.
Wow. Yeah. And let's shift a little bit and talk about the amount of teamwork and collaboration that these projects take. It doesn't just take one person testing one thing, right? It's a huge collaborative effort.
Right.
Yeah, it certainly is. And again, those are learnings too that are very important, because again, in the medical device world, we can often sort of get really siloed and tunnel vision. If I'm an engineer working on a device, I can just get in that engineering mode and that's all I think about and all I see. But I'm sure when Mitch's team was there and they were experimenting, in the lab, I'm sure, Mitch, you had interns and you had senior level engineers and you had people of different various sorts of
Software,
backgrounds.
embedded systems, mechanical engineers, all different disciplines working on this one product.
Mm-hmm. And I think the way so some examples of sort of way the collaborative approach is important. But before I even get to that, our design team, who you would think at the stage of testing out this heavily electromechanical system, you would not necessarily need them, engaged day to day. But when we're doing this sort of really experimental work, and it's not really implementation in the early stages, so it is a bit of research. The ideas come from everywhere. The design teams we have tend to be very, hardware savvy, and so we can get great ideas from virtually any source. It was from the designers were shoulder to shoulder with the engineers, doing the testing and evaluation and modifications, but so were the interns, who don't necessarily come with the years of experience to tell you all the things that have gone wrong in the past. So they're sort of free to come up with ideas that may be absurd, but maybe exactly the solution you're looking for. And then when you break it down further, you would think that some of these things are just purely mechanical, but the electronics and the controls, have to work very closely synchronized with all of the mechanisms. When we talk about the payment system and the interaction on the electronic side, it's you need the embedded systems people working very closely with the electrical engineers who kind of understand the timing and things inside the electronics. It's a very no problem is purely in one function, the solution. And that's when you need everybody kind of together. And I will say this, that one of the challenges we have, I think we all have, in working in the environment, current environment with COVID, is that it is challenging to get the talents you need in one physical place to be able to collaborate like that. This Zoom meeting and things like this are very good for structured discussions, but when you, at certain points, there's no choice but to get the people together. And I know Tom's had to do it, and we've had to do it, that from time to time, people do have to physically get in the same space and solve problems.
Yeah, and Rachel, I can give you one example that this makes me think about. One time we were working on a surgical robot for St. Jude Medical, and this kind of collaboration that Mitch is describing, we thought it was necessary to involve different sorts of people in this research and this testing, this collaboration. So not only did we get the surgeons who were the user of this particular device, but also the techs that were there for doing the setup, as well as some of the researchers. You get them all into one room. And one of the things that we discovered on the surgical robot is that when the surgeon would normally control the device that was going to have femoral access into the patient, the device was sitting on a table this way and they were approaching a table this way. And so they operated it in this fashion. So they were turning controls and doing things in this fashion. And that's what they were used to. We had a technician in the room who was also participating in the research. And then when it was time to load a guide wire into the device, we noticed that the surgeon had the technician load the guide wire because the technician was standing back here on the other side alongside the bed. And that person had sort of a linear access, visual access to the femoral port. And they were more easily able to load the guide wire because they could do it in this orientation as opposed to a perpendicular orientation. They were doing it axially. And the light bulb went off. It's like, why would we make a robot mimic the way a human does it when we can make the robot do it simpler, because the robot doesn't have the limitations of a human. And again, there's this yin and this yang, because we learn a lot in our devices by looking at human anatomy, biology, seeing how things, biomimicry, seeing how biology works, and we can learn that, incorporate it in. But then we also have to do the yang and realize we can have a robot do something in a different way than a human would. So you learn that lesson. We don't need to make the robot do exactly what a human would do, just like Mitch's team learned that the robot doesn't have to do it exactly the way the human does. The robot just has to do it. And humans are limited to the way our digits work, So I think there's a learning lesson both ways in that yin and yang with biomimicry.
I think to add to that too is, again, getting back to the idea of just takes multiple people that think in different ways. I mean, that's really critical when you're doing things like this, is you don't want people who all think in the same way. One of our engineers is really much more hands-on than some of the others who are a little more analytical. And he has a great way of solving problems, and he's multidisciplinary. So I would call him the jack of all trades, maybe, and that he knows a little bit about the electronics, he knows a little bit about the embedded software, he knows a little bit about the mechanics, and he comes up with ideas because he's had to solve so many field problems in things when you don't have the luxury of time to solve the problem. You don't have all the resources available that you might have back in your office or your prototype shop. And he's left with a situation where he has to solve the problem on the spot. And he happened to come up with a lot of really great ideas. And I would have to say, this one engineer, I'd have to give a lot of credit for the fact that we got the opening mechanism to work from this person who, just is not in the usual path of a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer, but he's a system thinker, and he's a hands-on thinker, and he's a very practical minded person. So it's really helpful to have all kinds of minds working together, whether it's be a medical device or a complex industrial or commercial product.
Yeah, that whole concept of design thinking, where we all put our minds together to solve a problem, because it's really what we do in the end with product design, right? Okay, guys, last question. I've got a question for each of you, and we want to know what makes IPS and Kablooe Design unique in your approach to product design.
Sure. Do you want to start, Mitch, or do you want me to dive in on that? Okay. Well, you kind of touched on it, Rachel, leading up to the question, talking about the design thinking, because obviously the important things in design thinking are the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if you've put together a diverse team and you're getting really good diverse input into your innovation solution, that's a great path. But you want to make sure that when you do that, you're doing it appropriately. So at Kablooe, we sort of have a methodology we use to take that design thinking and take this dispersed team of people with different backgrounds and disciplines, putting them together. And we have a way of bringing that together and gelling it so we get really good data and really good results. And we do this by not necessarily looking at the device and the technology and what it does and what we want it to do. We sort of back off from that and take a bigger holistic picture and look at the job that device is supposed to do. And we break that job down into a bunch of discrete tasks that have to happen in order for that job to successfully occur. And then we look at every one of those pieces and we ask ourselves, what does a user need to do to be successful in every one of those pieces? And that's where our research happens. That's where we're looking, we're watching users, we're getting these feedback from all of these different various people, and we're filling out those pieces of the pie. I think that's a very unique way to approach design thinking. It's a very rich and robust way to approach design thinking. And if we couple that with our failing smart techniques in there, we end up getting what I feel is a really high level of innovation at the end, but through a process that's very efficient. And not only that, it makes it a ton of fun. And people get on these projects and they just have a blast because the way that a project, when it's structured like that, flows with the amount of teamwork and the amount of creativity and the activities and the development, it just becomes a very fun exercise for the team.
I think one of the things, I think it's a great question because, IPS and Kablooe are part of the same parent company as of, the last several months. And, we were at IPS, we're big advocates of having Tom and his team, at Kablooe join us because we bring, this deep domain experience in the medical device space that Tom and his team bring, especially on the front end understandings. And now we couple that with IPS having a very strong, and deep engineering team and diverse engineering team. We're able to really tackle problems that are just, order of magnitude more difficult and more targeted than we could in the past. We really have a great combined team, and our folks, work great together, mutual respect, and it's really bringing great value to our customers.
Yeah, I would agree. And the idea that, here in our Minneapolis office, we can have biomedical people and design people and human factors people. And we know that in the New York office, we're backed up by Mitch's team of, engineering people and software people and embedded people and systems people and electrical people. I mean, it's a strong, it's definitely a strong collaboration where we can get a lot done. And like Mitch said, we can solve a lot of problems in a very exciting way.
Right. I think we're also both, in terms of our ability to execute on medtech oriented products is, we're both our companies are in real hotbeds of medical research. I mean, Tom can talk about the institutions in his area. I know here on Long Island, where IPS is located, we have a tight relationship with Stony Brook University and the related hospital. The Hofstra University has a relationship with Northwell Systems, which makes big investments into medtech, and then we're adjacent to all the New York City based medical institutions. So we're able, and Tom has a parallel, I think, in Minneapolis as well, that drives a lot of the growth of new medical technology, along with the places to do things like clinical trials and user studies.
Yeah, because that's where that in-person work happens often. And even though, you can design things across the world and do things virtually, there is still something about the geography that you're in and dealing with people and institutions and clinical situations that are in your geography, not just from an ease standpoint, which, of course, is a given, but also, in an expense standpoint, but also, there's something more ethereal about, that proximity and that human contact when you have to have it. Mm-hmm. And it just happens that way. It's not like we do that on purpose, but you look at all the clients we talk to all over the world and all over the nation, and still just by default, at least half of them are right here in our geography, so yeah. It's the way it works, and it's fine, it's good.
Yes, it's great. Well, there you have it, folks. That's what a cold beer taught us about medical device development. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Tom, for giving us your time and insight and wisdom. You can find Intelligent Product Solutions at intelligentproduct.solutions. That's our website, intelligentproduct, one word, .solutions. And you can find Kablooe Design at kablooe.com. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Rachel.
Bye.
Bye.